It's a great pleasure to be here and to act as a person who's going to try and cross-fertilise a little bit from the area of neuroscience and tell you a little bit about what we understand now about the neuroscience of decision-making and how it involves emotion. Now, because I realise that you won't be familiar with a few of the neuroscience slides I'm going to show, I want to put up a few of the conclusions that I'm going to be working towards so that everyone's quite clear what we think about how the brain takes decisions. One of the important points I want to make, the third one there, is that the brain has a large number of different reward systems. We're trying to optimize many things. And those rewards are often defined initially by genes, which make us like food, for example, or warmth, comfort, reproduction, and so on. So we shouldn't think that there's necessarily a single utility function, or that that's stable. Things will be changing from time to time, even on a minute-by-minute basis, for what is the most important thing. Then how do we actually take these decisions? Well, we think that humans have two decision-making systems. The first is an emotional one. That's one which has a long basis in evolution and is similar in animals. That's based on rewards, which have often been gene-specified. But humans are interesting because in addition to that, they have a separate system, a rational long-term planning system, and that has different interests. So the emotions tend to be in the interest of your genes, in the end, reproduction and passing the genes on to the next generation. That's what influences that sort of decision. But the rational system can take decisions in your own individual interest for the phenotype. For example, one might decide not to have children and to be a doctor or something like that. And so the point there is that there's often a conflict whenever we take decisions between what our emotions may want us to do and what our rational planning wants us to do. And we need to take that into account, especially because, the next point down, when decisions are taken, they often seem to be influenced by noise in the brain. When I say noise, what I'm talking about here is the random spiking times of neurons which introduce noise into the brain and mean that if the odds are equal, then sometimes you'll choose this and sometimes you'll choose that, so that it may be wise to take each decision several times. So I would comment that even in a rational system, the human rational system, logic may not be applied particularly well. So that some of the assumptions of economics as I understand it, I'm not an economist, may not apply perfectly. So neuroeconomics may be able to identify many different value systems and the probabilistic systems that may be used. Now, here again, just to give you some of the most important points that I would like to alert you to from neuroscience, as a few more sort of summary points. So the first thing is that decisions are actually made, we now more or less understand, by what we call attractor networks in the brain, which I'll describe to you, which are nonlinear decision-making systems with noise introduced by the random spiking times of neurons. And that's why decision-making is probabilistic. I've talked about the two routes to decisions, and I've hinted that the interests of the two systems are different. That's point 4. 5. Who chooses between the systems? If I have an emotional input telling me to do something and a rational input, how do I choose between those two? Again, noise in the brain is likely to be important. 6. The rational system does not really, the human rational system doesn't meet the criteria of microeconomics. Its logic and weighting of outcomes is imperfect, and it's noisy and probabilistic. And then my last point, 7 there, is that I want to emphasize to you that humans have many different types of reward. We think there's about 100-dimensional space of different rewards that are being programmed into us initially for things that we might like, and then on top of that we can use our reasoning system to identify further rewards. One of the things I want to emphasize is that we're all different. So if we have a major decision maker taking macroeconomic decisions, it may be interesting to realize that some people are more sensitive to punishing events to losses than others. So we're not all the same sort of decision maker. So here are, for my sort of last, as it were, summary slide, what I think the implications may be from neuroscience for macroeconomics. So in macroeconomics, it's assumed that the economy behaves like a representative agent who can take rational and logical decisions. So given the neuroscience of decision making, the situation is more complex. The utility function may be multidimensional. The reward value along each dimension may fluctuate, and the reasoning may be imperfect. Each individual is different. Decisions may be made on emotional or rational bases. So these things need to be taken into account. For example, in 6, major policymakers may make decisions in different ways. A factor that's very important, we believe, is reputation. So it turns out that in social situations with animals, if one's reputation is called into question, that may be a very damaging event in a social situation. And the same, of course, is true in humans. So when someone takes an economic decision, their reputation may be something which, through the emotional system, may have a bearing on that. Okay, here's what we think emotions are. So emotions, we believe, are states elicited by rewards and punishers. A reward is anything that you'll work to obtain, and a punisher is anything that you'll work to escape from or avoid. Now, that's a simple operational definition, and it led to rapid advances in understanding brain mechanisms involved in emotion, if one accepts that as the operational definition. And most people in neuroscience are accepting it. Then I've said that via natural selection, genes have built receptors for stimuli that, by helping to encode primary rewards, such as nice taste, nice touch, and so on, will increase their fitness, the gene's fitness. That's the point. That's the emotional system. And they provide the goals for our actions. Then emotions are the states elicited by these gene-specified primary reinforcers. And then further down, a reasoning rational system allows these gene-specified emotion-related reinforcers to be deferred. That's the important point. In terms of longer-term goals, in the interests of the individual, the phenotype. And so there's inherently a conflict in many human decisions. Now we're getting down to a bit of the architecture of the brain. If we look at the second one down there, that's the standard emotional system that's present in humans: action, outcome, goal-directed learning. A bit of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex, together with the amygdala, decodes what stimuli are in terms of their value. And we now understand a lot about how value is represented in the brain. So the first part of this has nothing to do with value, the association cortex and so on. It's only after we get into the orbitofrontal cortex that things are represented not as objects, but in terms of their value. That's one system. Underneath it, there's a habit system. So if you keep taking decisions, you take the decision even without thinking. They become essentially stimulus-response habits. The top one, explicit actions, is the important one. That's the syntactic system, the system that uses language and reasoning to take decisions. Okay, so here's how the definition works out. So if I think S plus is a reward. What sort of emotions do I get? Well, I get pleasure or elation. If I look at S minus going down, then that's a punisher, and I might feel fear. Importantly, non-reward. If I don't obtain an expected reward, I might feel angry. If I can do something about it, active. Or I might feel sad if there's nothing that I can do about it. So that just gives you an idea how this approach leads to an interesting classification for emotions. Now this slide shows you that the human brain, which is this diagram here, has a vast area of orbitofrontal cortex, the cortex just above your eyes, devoted to emotion. Much bigger even than in monkeys, whereas the rat doesn't have most of that cortex. So that system has developed greatly in humans for particularly social decision making, we think. Now, here's the architecture that I'm talking about. This is the back of the brain, the front of the brain, the top and the bottom. This is the orbitofrontal cortex, the bit just above your eyes. That receives from all sensory modalities, visual, taste, olfaction, touch, and it represents the reward value of stimuli. That system influences something that you may know about, the dopamine neurons, which people think are involved in reinforcement learning. Turns out that the theory of this system was until recently without any knowledge of where the reward comes from. But we now think it's via orbitofrontal cortex projecting down to that system. So here's the architecture of your brains as we understand it now for emotion. Each sensory system works forward to a part of cortex that represents what the stimulus is. After that, you go into this reward tier, orbitofrontal cortex and amygdala, which represent value. And then after that, you go into systems that produce habit behavior or goal-directed emotions, or which take binary decisions, which choose between different rewards. Okay, that's the sort of background. Now into a little bit of neuroscience, so you can see what it's all based on. So one can record from single brain cells. This is a single neuron firing in the orbitofrontal cortex of a monkey to the taste of sweet. Here's one of the important bits of evidence that value is represented. The neuron here fires very fast when the monkey tastes sweet, when he's hungry. But when he's fed to satiety, the neuron stops responding. And here's a principle that's never got into economics, as far as I know, sensory-specific satiety. If you have a lot of one reward, in this case glucose, you don't like it anymore, but you will still take another, even quite similar reward, in this case blackcurrant juice. So this is an important thing to understand, that the value system shows this decline over time in the pleasure or reward value that you get. And that means if you're thinking about utility functions, that you shouldn't think they will necessarily be stable for a very long time. As you get some of that reward may become less attractive. So here's another very important point just to emphasize. These are two different brain cells with their firing rates shown up here and a set of different stimuli. So this brain cell responds to some tastes by increasing its firing rate. These are tastes. It does not respond to fat in the mouth, and it does respond to chili, here, capsaicin. This brain cell has no response to taste, does respond to fat in the mouth, and does not respond to capsaicin. The point is, the reward system is not a general reward system. There is no general representation of currency that has been found in terms of general currency. All the representations we find in the brain are in terms of very specific rewards. And the reason we believe for that is that then when you take a decision, you know, because the decision has been about, say, this taste or this monetary reward, what the decision is, because the decision network keeps representing the specific reward you've chosen, so that then you can perform actions to obtain that reward. So my summary for that little bit of data is that there's a neuronal representation of stimulus value in the orbitofrontal cortex. Then that value representation is projected to cingulate cortex, which enables you to perform goal-directed actions to obtain a reward. Now, what about monetary value? So if we do imaging in humans, we can make this stimulus be more associated probabilistically with obtaining money than this one. And the human decides in a magnet during brain scanning which one to obtain. And what we find is that in this part of the brain, and this is a vertical slice through your orbitofrontal cortex, so here are the eyes, and here's the orbitofrontal cortex, we find that medial orbitofrontal cortex here, for gain, has an increase of activity, and a decrease to loss. In contrast, the lateral orbitofrontal cortex here has an increase to loss and a decrease to gain. So there's a push-pull representation of monetary reward in your orbitofrontal cortex. But, I emphasise, at the neuronal level, it's separate from every other type of reward. So economic value is represented in the human orbitofrontal cortex. Now here's another principle. That bit of the brain, the orbitofrontal cortex, is influenced by cognition. So if you're taking a decision, what you're told can influence the value representation. We discovered this when humans were smelling something that is a bit like the smell of brie. And on some trials we used a word to say it's going to be cheese, and on other trials body odour. And what we found is that in this bit of the brain, orbitofrontal cortex or pregenial cingulate, you get a bigger signal to the smell if you're told with a word that it's cheese than body odour. The point here is that cognition comes right down into your emotion system to influence how that part of your decision-making system works. Okay? So you may think this stimulus has great value, but remember that what you have been told about it is actually getting down into your value representation system. One other point that I would like to make is there are major individual differences. One study we did was on chocolate cravers. And what we found is you get much more response in this orbitofrontal cortex to chocolate in people who are chocolate cravers. And I won't emphasise that, but the point I'm making is there are individual differences. And they have to be taken into account when we're thinking about decision makers. Indeed, we understand personality now as being different sensitivities to different rewards and punishers. If I'm very sensitive to punishers, then I'm probably going to be introverted and non-impulsive. If I'm not sensitive to punishers or to losing reward, I'm going to be impulsive. And that will influence how individuals take decisions. And we need to take that into account, I think, when we're thinking about macroeconomics and decision making. Now, there is another very important system in your orbitofrontal cortex. There's a system here where a single neuron, and this is the representation of a single neuron on a single trial, produces lots and lots of activity if a reward is expected, an action is taken, a lick, but the reward is not obtained. So this is specifically a system that responds when you have less reward than you expect. Very, very important again in decision making, but that's a very important part of what goes on in your orbitofrontal cortex. But that will be different in different individuals. Okay, now on to a slightly different topic. How does the brain take decisions? So here's the way we think it's implemented, and this is the architecture of your bits of your cortex. You have neurons with recurrent collateral connections. You put in decision variables lambda 1 or lambda 2, and they drive, for example, these neurons, and through the recurrent collaterals, this set tend to have positive feedback. But also, through the recurrent collaterals, the lambda 2 set tend to have positive feedback. So we have a fight here. We have a fight with two inputs, each trying to produce positive feedback, and in the end, because we have some inhibitory interneurons, some of these neurons will build into a high firing rate, and others will be inhibited into a low firing rate. So, when this happens, the random spiking times of the neurons may be more in this population than in this. And on that trial, this population would win. On another trial, there might be more spikes in that population, and that population would win. Now, one of the things that happens in such a decision-making system is that the firing rate, which I'm plotting up here, and this is time along here, is higher if you make it an easy decision than if you make it a difficult decision. That's just a property of this decision-making attractor system. So we did an experiment to test if we could find a part of the brain which represents more easy decisions than difficult decisions. This is the brain signal, this is time, human neuroimaging, and this bit of the brain, a bit of medial prefrontal cortex, is implicated in decision making. That can be decision making, for example, between olfactory or temperature stimuli or other types of stimuli. Now, to emphasize what's happening here, we can actually predict a decision before the information is provided. So here we have a simulation of decision making. At time equals 2 seconds, the decision variables are applied. But the winning population here starts to have higher activity even before that. And that's simply a signature that there's noise in the brain that can influence decision making. Right, so I'm coming towards, coming back to the summary slides and trying to make some conclusions. So decisions are made by nonlinear attractor networks with noise. So your decisions will be somewhat random on a trial-to-trial basis, if the odds are equal. Obviously, if the odds are very unequal, the probability will be more influenced by the higher reward. There are two ways to take decisions: the reward emotion system and the reasoning system. The interests are very different. There could be a conflict every time you take a decision. For example, if I take an economic decision, I might be influenced by my reputation or by perhaps an electorate that might be influenced. So there's a sort of emotional component in that sense, perhaps even to a financial decision. Then I say, who chooses between these systems? Well, it's another noisy decision-making process in the brain. And what one has to be aware of, the science tells us, is that you can't necessarily believe what the rational system tells you. If you put in a probe stimulus, which is not conscious, it's a subliminal one, that can influence the decision, but humans then make up a reason for why they took the decision. So we can't always be relied on to give a reliable account of why the decision was taken, when it's been taken in particular by the emotional system. And that's important to understand, I think. So even the rational system doesn't meet the criteria of macroeconomics. Its logic and weighting of outcomes is imperfect and it's noisy. And 7, there are many different rewards, as I've said. It's very important that the different rewards are all scaled on the same scale so that then the decision making works correctly. But there is no common currency as far as we know, and it wouldn't be useful in the brain. So what are the advantages of having this noisy decision making in the brain? Well, unpredictable behaviour can be useful in some situations. It can be very important in creativity, which our chairman mentioned. The way that we think you are led towards new thoughts is by the randomness in your memory recall system, which helps you to jump to a new part of the space. You can then use your reasoning to decide whether that's a useful jump or not. But that, we think, is part of creativity. So noise in the brain may be very useful. And I wrote a book with a theoretical physicist about that, and so that you can understand the image shown here. This is Odysseus. The Greeks knew all about this, using his rational system to avoid the attractors who were coming out of the sea, the sirens. So this is Odysseus realizing that there can be emotional and rational basis to decision making, which is one of the points that I've been making. And now just to finish up with this particular slide, which you've seen before. So in macroeconomics, I've said that one assumes a single representative agent, but I've said that all agents are somewhat different. There are individual differences. And I've said the situation is a bit more difficult with the brain. Each individual has a different set of value functions. Decisions can be made in the interests of your genes, or the interests of your individual person, or of course of your group. And the group decision could be useful both for your genes or for you as an individual. And so these factors underlying the neuroscience of human decision making, I think, perhaps need to be taken into account in building and utilising macroeconomic theories, and could influence decisions taken by major policymakers. And that's where I'll stop.
Thank you, Edmund. Absolutely fascinating. I was pretty struck by the Brie versus BO example, actually. I thought it was, words really matter for smells. Actually, words really matter for policies as well. I sometimes think that rather than calling it QE, which for some people is sort of equivalent of BO, different two-letter acronym, if we just call it money printing,